Hello, hello! Welcome back to Brenda's Books. This season I am narrating for you the fantasy romance Queen Andraya of Chaldrea, and today we are on Chapter 9. Here we go. Chapter 9. Race to Unrest. Andraya released a slow breath as every nobleman filed out of the council room. Besnik hung back along with Alvin, who still stood quiet and stoic in the corner. "A fine meeting you led, Your Majesty," Besnik announced. "Quite productive." "How kind of you. Although not everyone is convinced of the idea not to trade with Gulin, I do hope we will arrive at that conclusion eventually." The Duke bore it well. "With your mind, absolutely," Besnik said, pulling on his suspenders. "Thank you, sir. Now, if you don't mind, I need to speak with the butler." "Of course," Besnik said with a bow, and exited the room. "Your Majesty, thank you," Alvin said, once they were alone. Andraya turned to him with a questioning look. "For keeping your promise to me," he clarified. "I do not know where my family would go without my position here." Andraya's heart warmed. "Of course, Alvin." Then just as quickly her heart sank. "But I have not kept a promise to someone else very dear to me, and I need to make it right." "How may I assist you, my queen?" Alvin said, in his low, rumbly voice. "I need to pay for an emergency vessel to sail to Medine." She raised her hands. "I realize I missed the departure this morning, but this still needs to happen. Would you please send a message to the Marquis of Rica and inform him I must have a ship sail out at first light tomorrow with a most urgent request? He must have a spare vessel, and I will pay double to anyone who is inconvenienced by this. Actually, I will draft the message for you, and all you will need to do is deliver it." Andraya reached down on the silver table and rummaged through her papers to find a blank sheet. "I would be honored to do anything you ask of me, Your Majesty, but I do know that all of the vessels from the Rica region are in use." Andraya closed her eyes as her head flopped low. "However, if your message is indeed pressing, may I offer a suggestion?" She gave him a dubious look. "By all means. You could request this message to be sent out from the Griffin port. I do believe their next ship departs at dusk." "At dusk? Why would they depart in the dark?" Alvin shrugged lightly. "It is quite common for that particular port." Andraya rubbed her mouth. "How very peculiar. Even still, my message must arrive in Medine, and the Westport does not ship to the east." Alvin cleared his throat. "Forgive me, Your Majesty, but it does. Twice a week, actually." "Twice a week?" Andraya couldn't quite mask her astonishment. "What on earth for?" Alvin clasped his hands behind his back. "I do not know the particulars, Your Majesty." Andraya let out an exasperated huff and put her hands on her hips. Gordon really was a hateful man. For what purpose did he lie to me about this? Alvin seemed to understand this question was rhetorical. "I am sorry," he said in a low voice. "And I suppose I should not be surprised that these mysterious routines happen at the very regional port that Marquis Draven is in charge of?" Alvin gave her a look like he agreed, but said nothing. Andraya shook her head and stared at the ground. "Well, considering you know much more about this than I do, which island is their destination?" "I believe it is Gulin. However, they occasionally drop goods off at Medine on their way. Such a request would certainly not be out of the ordinary." Andraya let out an enormous sigh. "Alvin, I cannot tell you how wonderful you are." The butler attempted to conceal his smile, but it cut through anyway. "You are too kind, Your Majesty." Andraya smiled fully. "You know I am not." She turned back to the table and drafted an instructional note. "Will you follow me to my royal office? I must close my other letter with the head crown's seal." "As you wish," the butler said with a bow. Alvin followed the queen through the hallway and down the spiral staircase until they reached the marble floors at the bottom. Andraya's high heels echoed loudly off the high-vaulted ceilings. She spotted Prince Steffan in the sitting room, reading a book in a large velvet chair. He stood and bowed as she passed. She acknowledged him with a nod and turned a sharp corner to enter her royal office. Alvin shut the door behind them. "Would you please light a candle for me, Alvin?" the queen asked. She stuffed her letter into an envelope and glued it down with a hot wax mold and stamped it with her golden signet ring that was intricately constructed with a Chaldrayan flag. Alvin stepped to her side with a lit candle, and the two of them sealed the envelope shut. She penned the words urgent on the front and signed her name. "I will have these sent out immediately, Your Majesty." "Thank you," the Queen replied. The butler bowed and left the room as if he were a mouse and not a man of large stature. Andraya let out a huge sigh of relief. She could not wait to tell Colleen she managed to fix her horrible mistake, and how good it would be to see Mrs. Forthright again. Her heart felt so much lighter when she exited her office. She actually offered Prince Steffan a genuine smile when she found him standing in the wide marble hallway to greet her. He bowed when their eyes met. "Your Majesty, may I have the pleasure of speaking with you?" "Of course, Your Highness." Andraya clicked her loud heels in his direction until she stood in front of the prince. "Yes?" she asked. Steffan took a short breath. "You were wonderful today. I am," he paused to think, "impressed with you." "Why then do you frown, sir?" Steffan smiled to make up for it. "I do not have words sufficient." "You are doing splendidly. Have you worked with Besnik yet?" Steffan nodded. "For most of yesterday." "Oh my, you must be determined." Steffan looked her straight in the eye. "Very much," he said. But Andraya couldn't help wonder if there were some double meaning to his response. "I suppose it would be quite interesting for me to study the Deldrian tongue. Perhaps I could coerce Besnik into tutoring the both of us." Steffan cocked his head as if he had a new idea. Your Majesty!" Andraya turned to see the butler speed-walking in her direction. "What is it, Alvin?" "Your Majesty," he said in a breathless voice before he reached her. "My deepest apologies, but the carriage headed to the Griffin Port has already left." "Without my letters?" Alvin nodded. "Well, we must send out another carriage at once to catch up to them." Alvin shook his head with vigor. "It left an hour ago. Oh, I am so sorry, my queen." No, Alvin. It will be dusk in not over an hour," Andraya cried. "I apologize profusely, Your Majesty," Alvin said in haste. Andraya rubbed her mouth as she tried to think. Prince Steffan placed a hand on her arm. "What is it?" he asked, glancing back and forth between her and the butler. "A stable hand," Andraya exclaimed. "A horse can catch up with the carriage. It must." The queen whirled around and with great effort heaved open the large double doors of the palace entrance. She lifted her skirt so as to scamper down the many steep steps, but the extreme high heels she had chosen were hindering the task tremendously. "Jace!" Andraya cried. She knew full well the stable-master could not hear her, as the stables were quite a distance away. But she continued to holler anyway. "Jace!" The butler and the prince managed the steps at an incredible rate and were already darting into the gardens before the queen even reached the bottom of the stairs. "Of all the crusted high heels," Andraya growled. She yanked off her shoes and sprinted after the men. But now her skirt was far too long and she tripped several times on the garden paths. Her feet slowed when she reached the squishy dirt of the royal cemetery. She passed right by Gordon's grave and cursed him as she did so. She stopped short when she reached the stable grounds, which were nothing less than a swamp of mud. She found Steffan and Alvin searching the stables in haste. "Jace!" Andraya called again. Steffan and Alvin spun around to face her. "Your Majesty," Alvin called, "we cannot find anyone. They must have all gone to the orchards to help harvest the oranges." Andraya let out an exasperated breath and leaned her head back to look at the sky. The prince started to say something, but Andraya cut him off. "Then I will ride Chestnut," the queen said. At that moment she decided she would brave the mud, but her first step still managed to catch her skirt, and she went tumbling forward. Before she knew it, she was embraced in a pair of strong arms, which thankfully prevented her from taking a mud bath. "Which one is Chestnut?" Steffan asked. "The beautiful one in the first stable." Moments later, Andraya's horse stepped in front of her, with Prince Steffan on his back. "No one else rides my horse," Andraya disputed. Steffan reached down to offer her his hand. "Then come with me," he said. Andraya started to say. Then she realized there was no time to argue, so she clasped her hand in his, stepped into the stirrups, and jumped onto her horse. "Let's go!" she ordered. "What about your letters?" Steffan asked. Andraya threw her head back. "Of course." "Alvin!" she called loudly, but he was already at her side. "Here you are, Your Majesty." Andraya grabbed the letters and frantically looked for somewhere on her person to keep them safe, but her options were next to nil. Steffan took them out of her hands and tucked them away in his breast pocket. "If you would like to go fast, Your Majesty, please hold on." Andraya wrapped her arms around the prince, and Chestnut whinnied and darted away. The queen thought how unfortunate it was that her worry over catching the carriage prevented her from enjoying holding on to the prince. But so it was. With the skillful hand of Steffan, Chestnut sped out of the palace property within 15 minutes. Once they reached a traveling highway, Chestnut's pounding hooves accelerated. Just as Andraya thought her horse might prefer running on the grass adjacent to the road, Steffan led him to the side to do just that. Andraya peered under Steffan's arm as the wind whipped in her face. She begged her eyes to see a royal carriage ahead, but her vision only provided an empty road that stretched for miles. So she closed her eyes and focused on the rhythm of the ride. After what must have been an hour, Steffan called back to the queen over his shoulder. "Have you seen your carriage, my queen?" "I have not, but it looks like we are coming upon the port." A few minutes more, and Chestnut slowed to a trot. Andraya had forgotten what commoner life looked like. The crowds, the clothes, and the noise. So much noise. Then there was the smell of seawater. She missed that smell. Steffan brought Chestnut to a stop when they reached the port's entrance. A ragged-looking man took a pipe out of his mouth and blew out a puff of smoke. That's when he saw the queen. His eyes practically fell out of their sockets. He coughed and hacked and wheezed for a long minute, batting away the smoke from his face. When he finally found his voice, he managed to wheeze, "Your Majesty." Then he froze in place and gawked openly. Steffan snapped his fingers in front of the man's eyes, to which he blinked rapidly. I'm sorry, Your Majesty. It's just that we weren't expecting you," he said in a raspy voice. He continued gawking as if he truly could not help himself. To that, Steffan shook his head and let out a breathless chuckle. "I realize that, Mr. Andraya asked. The man coughed again. "Mr. Weston, Your Majesty." He lifted his ragged hat and offered a clumsy bow. "Mr. Weston, I have urgent news that must be sent on the next ship. Would you be so kind as to tell me where I may find the captain?" "Oh, of course, Your Majesty. If you head down this here ramp." Andraya glanced down the ramp, which appeared to be more like an incredibly long and steep dirt road. Even with the sun lowering in the sky, Andraya could see one massive ship still at bay. Its large sail also served as the Chaldrayan flag. "You'll find a man with a yeller suit and white hat. He be the captain. He'll take care of your needs." "But—" "Yes?" Andraya questioned. "Well, it's just we don't usually allow them horses in. It's hard enough to keep this place clean to the Marquis's expectations without all the stuff that horses leave around." Steffan let out an abrupt cough, which Andraya thought might have been a laugh. "Well, we would not want to displease the Marquis, now would we?" "Oh, no, Your Majesty. Unless you want to, then of course we will." "No, Mr. Weston. I am happy to go talk to the captain on foot." "Yes, Your Majesty. I'll take good care of your horse. We've got a fine stable to keep him in just around this here tree." Prince Steffan jumped off and offered Andraya his hand. Then Andraya's heart jumped with sudden alarm. Here she was, the queen, arriving at a port without announcement and barefoot, with thousands of onlookers. She managed a fleeting glance at her feet and was happy to note her long dress currently covered them completely. Steffan gave her a questioning look. Andraya inhaled a shaky breath. "Your Highness, would you please lift me down carefully?" Steffan now looked all the more confused. "Of course." He grabbed the queen by the waist and gently brought her to the ground, which caused her long hem to fold around her feet. Mr. Weston led Chestnut by his reins down a small hill and around a large juniper tree to the stables that were hidden from her view. Prince Steffan gently placed his hands on either side of the queen's shoulders and looked into her eyes as if attempting to decipher something. "What is it, my queen?" I know this sudden distress of yours did not come because you were afraid to speak with the captain. I would not be if I were wearing shoes." Steffan laughed, then coughed and cleared his throat. "It is not funny, Your Highness," Andraya said in a low voice. "I am the queen. And have you not noticed all these people staring at us?" Steffan glanced around casually, then turned back to Andraya. "I can assure you, Your Majesty, that they are not staring at us. They are staring at you. But I promise they are not looking at your feet." Andraya flushed at that. Steffan tried to hide his smile by ducking his head a bit. Andraya groaned internally. She would never live this down. Steffan pursed his lips and tried to be serious. "But really, my queen, your dress is long enough." "But I will have to lift it up in order to walk. A queen certainly cannot trip." Steffan fought back another smile. "Indeed not. I suppose I could carry you to the captain." Andraya scowled. "You are enjoying this." Steffan laughed but tried to keep it quiet. "I apologize. I can request the captain to come here to speak with you, or I can deliver your letters to him myself, if you would like." "Oh, would you please take the letters to him? I do not wish to be so pretentious to order him to come to me." Steffan's eyes beamed at her. "It would be my honor. I am certain you will have many people who will wish to speak with you." "Stand your ground," he said with a wink. Andraya shot him a look of astonishment, but Steffan just grinned. He pivoted and began walking down the ramp. "Oh, Your Highness," Andraya called. Steffan turned to face her. One leg rested on higher ground, and his once well-set hair, which had now been tousled from their windy ride, whipped around in the ocean breeze. And oddly, this made him all the more handsome, the moment deemed absolutely portrait-worthy. "Do make certain he understands the letters must go to Medine," the queen said. Steffan nodded and spun back around. Now that Andraya was alone, she glanced around with wary eyes. The queen knew this port was busy, but she still could not have imagined this. Men bustled everywhere, carrying lumber of all sizes, and pulling wheelbarrows full to the brim with oranges, and hefting boxes full of lemons. Even women and children carried stuffed burlap sacks over their shoulders. And all the hollering! The queen had never heard anything like it. Many others who were not presently engaged in activity stood by and openly stared at the queen with relentless eyes. One young boy peeked around his mother's leg. "Is that the queen, Mama?" "Yes." "What's she doing here?" "I don't know, Pumpkin." "Hi, Queen Andraya! Hi!" the boy called loudly, with a big wave of his hand. Andraya smiled and waved back. "Can I go talk to her, Mama?" he asked. "No, I don't think that would be a good idea," the mother said. But before she finished her sentence, the boy was already running toward her. Andraya crouched to his height. "Hello there." "You're pretty," the little boy said, his eyes popping out. "And you are sweet," Andraya replied. The boy's bravery must have inspired others, because suddenly Andraya found herself clamored by children. "Your dress is smooth. You have big lips. Are those eyelashes real? Can I touch them?" Andraya laughed as she asked what their names were and what they did for play. But then their smiling faces grew blurry and shaky, and her head swirled with dizziness. She had to put her hands on the road to keep from falling over on top of a little girl. "Are you all right, Queen Andraya? Why are you holding your head?" "I am fine," the queen replied. But before she could prevent it, she collapsed on the dirt ground. And that concludes Chapter 9. Thanks for listening. I hope you join me next week for Chapter 10, which is called Beachside Confidant. If you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.